Well, welcome to you, everyone. I know some people are still joining. And today, I wanted to talk a little bit more about reflection on death. Last week, we had discussion, conversation about death reflection and preparation for dying. And someone brought up a question a couple of days ago or yesterday, I don't know, but about something that they had heard. And I had also heard this. I have also heard the same thing. I'm curious how many others have heard that they say that the last thought we have before we die is what conditions our rebirth. The thought in the mind when we die. And this person was saying that's a scary concept because who knows what that might be? Who knows what the situation might be? Maybe there's fear, maybe there's something happening with the brain, with the mind, with the body that makes that not a peaceful, uplifted, happy, beautiful mental state. So I remember first hearing this many years ago, probably about 25 years ago, the first visit or so that I made to Thailand, spending time in the monastery where my son, who was a monk, was living. And because he was a young monk, and the first time I visited, he was still a Samanera novice. And then after that, of course, a new bhikkhu. And he would bring his friends over who might also be novices or newly ordained monks and pretty young in the practice, many of them. And they talked about this idea that, this final mind moment in this life conditions our rebirth. And I didn't know much at all yet at that point about the Dhamma. And I found that kind of a scary thought. I think the next time I encountered it was when I was in robes and I was attending a meeting with a senior. I was attending a meeting with a senior nun. And it was a meeting at a hospital where this various monastics and ministers from different Buddhist groups were invited to come together to talk to the chaplaincy team. Because in this hospital, most of the chaplains were not Buddhist. I don't know if they had any Buddhist chaplains on staff, but they had quite a few Buddhist patients at the hospital, and they wanted to understand how to counsel them with regard to illness and death. And so they brought in people from different Buddhist groups, different sects. And one of the things that came out of the conversation was this idea that was stated as a concept that was consistent across the Buddhist traditions, that this final moment of thought would be the conditions for the rebirth. Now, studying the suttas, you do not find this in the suttas. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The Buddha talks in many ways, in many contexts, about how it is that our actions, especially our habitual actions, really set up the results for our rebirth. It's karma. And in reflecting on this and digging around a little bit, I know that this idea comes from the commentarial period, not from the early Buddhist texts. But I found this great summary of the, let me see if I can put it in put a link in the chat. I found this great summary of this concept, and it's from a site that's called Guide to Buddhism A to Z, and it was created by a monk named Bhante Sravasti Dhammika. He's actually Australian-born monk who got ordained, I think, probably in India. He first went to Thailand and then got ordained and spent most of his bhikkhu life, or he's still alive as far as I know, is spending most of his time in Sri Lanka and Singapore. And I need to try to find the chat window here. It's under more. Okay. Thank you. There's the link to the page where this article is. I'm not suggesting you go there now, but when you wish. Anyway, he starts out talking about this idea, and he said that the very first notion of it comes in one of these later texts, where the King Melinda is questioning this monk Nagasena, and there's this dialogue between them. And in that questioning, at one point, one of the answers says, if someone did unskillful things for 100 years, but at the time of death was mindful for one moment of the Buddha, he would be reborn amongst the devas. So this suggestion that somehow you can change it all at the last minute was already kind of in the air. Now this came around the 1st century BC. No, in the Common Era, so the 1st century CE. And it was really brought to fullness in the Visuddhimagga, which is about 1,000 years after the Buddha lived. And it really, the Venerable Dhammika really points out the ways in which this conflicts with what the Buddha actually said over and over again about how, we create our future with the actions we do now. And we're, as you can see, that when you picked up the Buddhist practice and you started to develop skills in virtue and development of the mind and development of wisdom, that the trajectory of your life changed. And we see this in people all the time. And that trajectory, that's the direction you're going. And when you take your last breath, that's probably the direction you're still going to be going. This is something that can become apparent also in insight, with insight. To see that when we take that last breath, we then go on, we keep going in the same direction. That's the most probable result. And there's a lovely sutta that I want to share with you. I'm just going to read it to you. I'm not going to show it to you. It's a sweet story. It's the Buddha's cousin, Mahanama. He was Venerable Anuruddha's brother. And he said to the Buddha, this city, this is where the Buddha lived, grew up, Kapilavatthu. He said, this is a very successful and prosperous, populous place full of people. The streets are cramped. And in the late afternoon, after paying homage to the Buddha or another esteemed mendicant, I enter the city and I encounter a stray elephant or horse or chariot or cart or some person. And at that time, I lose my mindfulness regarding the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha. And then I think, if I were to die right now, where would I be reborn in the next life? And the Buddha says, don't be afraid, Mahanama. Your death won't be a bad one. Your passing will not be bad. If you take someone whose mind has for a long time been imbued with faith, ethics, learning, generosity, and wisdom, their body consists of form. It's made up of the 4 elements produced by mother and father, built up from rice and porridge. It's liable to impermanence, to wearing away and erosion, to breaking up and destruction. Right here, the crows, vultures, hawks, dogs, jackals, and many kinds of little creatures devour it. But their mind rises up, headed for a higher place. The Buddha said, suppose a person was to sink a pot of ghee or oil into a deep lake and break it open. Its shards and chips would sink down, while the ghee or oil in it would rise up, headed for a higher place. In the same way, for someone whose mind has for a long time been imbued with faith, ethics, learning, generosity, and wisdom, their body consists of form made up of the 4 great elements, produced by mother and father, built up from rice and porridge, liable to impermanence, to wearing away and erosion, to breaking up and destruction. Right here, the crows, vultures, hawks, dogs, jackals, and many kinds of little creatures devour it. But their mind rises up, headed for a higher place. Your mind, Mahanama, has for a long time been imbued with faith, ethics, learning, generosity, and wisdom. Do not fear, Mahanama, do not fear. Your death will not be a bad one. Your passing will not be a bad one. So this idea of what will happen to me, of course, that's been a question for as long as human beings have been in existence, I'm sure. And this wonderful encouragement and reassurance of the Buddha, hopefully is encouragement for us to take the practice in all of its forms. And I like how all of those qualities are mentioned, including learning, certainly virtue, generosity, all of these different aspects of our development are part of what leads to a happier life and the confidence that we will experience the results of our good karma. So coming to a point in our life and a point in our practice where we have faith in that, where we trust karma. And we don't have to put so much emphasis on worrying about what's going to happen that's negative because of the mistakes we've made, but because of all the good that we're developing, we have the confidence and faith in where that leads. So one of the lessons in this is when we hear about things that we're told this is how it is, this is how it works, to always evaluate it in light of Dhamma, evaluate it in the light of the teachings that came from the Buddha himself. You know, and he really talked in many, many ways about the results of our actions. He also said that we can't, let's see how to say this, that we really shouldn't try to sort of predict or sort out the workings of karma. What it says is that you'll drive yourself crazy. You'll go mad if you try to work out the specifics of how karma works, because it's complex. The many actions over all this time that figure into it. But when we know that we've been traveling in the direction of the mind rising up, we can trust that that's just naturally how it works, like that beautiful simile. You know, the shards of the pot will fall away. That's what happens to the body. But the goodness inside rises up to a higher place. So when we compare what we hear to the Dhamma that we've learned from the Buddha, it should make sense. And sometimes what we see, even in the texts that are bundled together as part of the tradition, sometimes those things don't make sense. And it's okay. We don't have to discount. I wouldn't discount everything that came after the Buddha's time, for sure. There's a lot of encouraging, good, helpful guidance there. But to, you know, keep the mind open and attentive to what actually fits with what the Buddha taught, and follow that. Anyone have any questions or comments?
I have a question.
Yes.
I heard like another version of this that's maybe less naive, which is that if there's heavy karmas, such as you killed your mother and father, or a monastic, or something like that, and those will come first. And then if there's heavy good karmas, like maybe you practice jhanas or a lot of generosity or something, then those will come second. And I don't remember the exact order, but then the thing that you think when you die is ranking lower on this order, but it's still one of the things that would go into the rebirth. So I guess my question is, do you know where this comes from, and do you think this makes sense?
I don't know where it comes from, but I'm pretty sure it's not the suttas. So it's a later edition, whatever it is. And again, I think the Buddha talking about how impossible it is for an ordinary person, someone other than a Buddha. I mean, I think he talks about how the Buddha is the only one who can like really understand how the karma is going to play out. That, this is all speculation. And I think it's true that, I mean, the Buddha talks in the Vinaya, the Vinaya talks too about how, and in the suttas, that it's really heavy if we've killed our mother or we've killed our father, or if we've killed an arahant, or drawn the blood of the Buddha, those kinds of things. So heavy that you can't get enlightened in this lifetime, but you can get enlightened in future lifetimes. There's really nothing that's not subject to rehabilitation in the Buddhist philosophy. How that plays out, we can speculate, which is what I think that is, speculations. We can speculate that such an action would be very heavy on the mind. And we can also speculate that if we do a lot of generosity and a lot of good things, that's going to change the weight assignment to the karma. But I think the thing that is so unsettling about the idea that last thought would be somehow more important than all of the things we've been doing previously intentionally is that why should a random thought, we know how the mind works, the mind comes up with all kinds of random junk, the stuff that just comes into the mind. We're not really responsible for that. It's not an intentional thought. It's just the stuff that comes, because we somehow got exposed to it in some way, or we did think about it, or we did something in the past. But it's mostly, like those random things. It doesn't make sense that that's going to have a huge impact on what's going to happen to us. It depends, even in this lifetime, in this moment, no matter what weird thought comes into the mind, you can reject it, or you can give it energy and proliferate on it and develop it further. That part is karma you're creating now, if we do that. But if we're like, that's not what I'm going to think about or how I'm going to proceed, that's also karma we're creating in the moment. And in that final, when we're taking our last breath, that final conscious moment related to this body, that's not the end of our journey. And it's also, we may not have the agency at that point to do anything in particular about that thought. There's so many different circumstances that human beings could be in at that final moment. What if it's like the Mahanama, what if I'm terrified by this, elephant charging down the street I'm walking on or something, and the Buddha's like, yeah, don't worry about that. You're gonna be okay. You've been developing your mind. So I wouldn't give too much importance to that speculation. What's more important is, how am I going to live my life now? What am I going to do right now? How am I going to, let go of the past, set it to zero? Don't keep perpetuating those old thought patterns into the future. Turn towards the dukkha and really be with it, work through whatever is still hanging around there, and go on with the good qualities, cultivating the good qualities what I think. Anne?
Yes, so very recently, I had an experience. Was a teacher here, a resident here, who was teaching, as some of us have been, and she was teaching from a book of a Tibetan Rinpoche who was her guru way back.
Mm-hmm.
And he's been dead for many years. And you know, I don't know when it was known, but certainly died of alcoholism in his 40s. You may know who he is. It doesn't really matter. And, you know, he'd been involved in all kinds of inappropriate sexual behavior. So I'm looking at this book written by this Rinpoche, and I'm thinking, you know, he was and still is revered for his teaching. And I'm like, well, that doesn't really work for me, for somebody who's led a very unethical and an inappropriate life, which I don't think was appropriate back then. I mean, you know, now.
Yeah.
So how does one view the teachings of such a person? I mean, I just have a sort of aversion to that. And I'd rather read something else on the topic. The topic was wisdom. It was wisdom in terms of Tibet. And I'm like, well, you know, what was this guy's wisdom? And probably not really appropriate me just to chuck the whole teaching out, but that's the way I felt about it. So I'm interested in your reflections on that.
Yeah. It's not appropriate. It wasn't appropriate then. It wasn't appropriate back at the time of the Buddha. It was never appropriate to have inappropriate sexual relations, particularly when you're in a power differential of teacher and student.
Yeah.
And this unfortunately happens frequently. And I've been asked before, how do you relate to someone's Dhamma who's behaving in this way? Can you trust it? And I said, no, you can't trust it. But we can identify which parts accord with what the Buddha says and which parts don't. Can also really investigate why people follow such people, why they continue to revere them. You know, I'm reminded of the moment which we see recorded in the Vinaya, Theravada Vinaya, where the monastics, the Buddha and the mendicants are having their moon day observance. And it's time, the Buddha at that time was reciting all the monastic rules, the Patimokkha himself. And this one night, he doesn't do it. And it's like they're meditating and it's getting into the middle of the night. And Venerable Ananda says to the Buddha, could you do the recitation? Because it's getting really late. And the Buddha's silent. And they go for another few hours. And Ananda says the same thing. And this Buddha's silent. And then the next, it's starting to get light. And the Ananda's like, kind of now or never. And the Buddha says the Sangha is not pure. He can't recite the rules because someone in the Sangha is not pure. And Mahamoggallana could read minds, and he surveyed the minds of all the monastics there, and he could tell which monk had been having sexual relations. This is so much worse for a monastic or a teacher of Dhamma to be doing this than anyone else, really. It's just horrible to be positioning yourself, presenting yourself as celibate, as trustworthy, as representing the Dhamma, and then doing the opposite. And it's much heavier karma than if, the boss is doing this with his employees or something. That's bad enough. And so Mahamoggallana goes over to that monk and he says, you have to leave. You're the one. And the monk just sits there, silent. And then he says it to him again, and the monk just sits there silent. And then he grabs him by the arm and he takes him outside. He throws him out and he locks the door. And then the Buddha recites the Patimokkha and he tells them, I'm not going to do it anymore. You're going to have to take over doing it. And he said, I can't believe that monk was able to just sit there and not admit what he was doing. Just, yeah. So what I think we should do is have compassion for that person who's acting in that way, but also clarity. And when we look at the teachings of such a person, we have to evaluate, is this helpful? Is this in accordance with Dhamma, or is it not? Have compassion and understanding for people who follow such a person, but be clear, really clear. You don't want to go into aversion or blaming. There's always there's a history. There are reasons why people do what they do. And just the clarity of wisdom and the clarity of how we are going to relate to whatever it is. Continue to be kind, continue to be compassionate, but also really clear. Have those boundaries clear.
Okay, thank you.
There's no wiggle room on this.
No, that's what I think.
None. And that's how karma works. There's no wiggle room with karma. We can say, yeah, we can't figure it out because the algorithm is too complicated. But we don't have to figure it out. The Buddha said, it's impossible for bad, unwholesome actions to lead to a good result. It's impossible for good, wholesome actions to lead to a bad result. What are we going to do? Keep it clean. Take it seriously. Purify the mind. Purify our actions. And be comforted by that. Cynthia?
Thank you. Thank you for your question, Anne, and for your response, because it speaks to what I was talking about earlier. When I was listening, when you were talking about, this question of the impact of what's happening in the mind right at death and what happens during your whole life, in some ways they both felt sort of reassuring in an odd kind of way, because I was thinking, I mean, who knows, like, I could probably wouldn't get run over by an elephant, but I could get hit by a car or something, and who knows how, or if somebody attacks me on the street, it's like, who knows where the mind will go. But what was comforting about that was knowing how much of my time, my mental space is taken up by cultivating metta and doing chanting and that. So so I feel like I'm kind of covered, and the likelihood that my mind is going to be sending metta to the nurses around me or whatever at the moment of my death is a lot higher than if I was watching stuff on Facebook or something like that. But the other thing is that what was it? I kind of lost. The other thing is that I think it seems like they're connected. Well, maybe that's the same thing as what I was saying, that if one is cultivating wholesome qualities during one's life, one is more likely to be in it's like if when you're dying, you're thinking about people that you've killed and or even more minor, unskillful things, your mind's going to be all agitated, and that's makes it more likely that it's not going to be in a good calm space when you die. But if you're reflecting on positive things that you've done in your life and generosity and that sort of thing, that so I don't think there's really a distinction between the two in my mind. Anyway, that's kind of what went through my head.
Yeah, I like what you're bringing up, because it is important to remember that we want to try to have a peaceful, happy mind all the time, and particularly as we're approaching death. And this Sri Lankan practice that I've talked about before of keeping a log of the good actions, the generous, kind actions that you do during your life, and then someone reads it out to you at that time. You know, this is all for the purpose of trying to bring peace and calm to the mind and happiness. And those are good things to do. And what you said, Venerable Dhammika also touches on this in the article that I gave the link for. You know, you know, if you think about how one moment of thought conditions the next moment, then the last moment is going to be conditioned by the previous moment, and that one by the previous moment. And, you know, if that's how it works, that's also, you know, something that, you know, is useful. And, you know, like you said, if we are a lot of the time being, you know, infused and settled in the Dhamma, or we're chanting, or we're, you know, doing things that are kind, and we're filled with metta and compassion and so on, then that's way more likely that that's how it's going to be later. In fact, you know, the Buddha talked a lot about how the Brahma Viharas, you know, lead to a heavenly rebirth in the divine abodes, you know. And it's because of that, you know, we're developing that joy. If we practice jhana, and we really, you know, do a lot of it, and our mind is in that kind of altered state a lot, then it's likely to be in that kind of altered state after we die. So it's again, it's the consistency, the quantity, the quality. And you know, that is the case. But the random thought that comes up at the end because of some thing that's going on. Another thing I wanted to mention is that sometimes as practitioners, we can have this idealistic idea of what it's going to be like when we die, or how we want to, like, if we could control that, how we want it to be, or, you know, and it's good to let go of that kind of idea. We can have the intention to be peaceful and kind and calm and compassionate the whole way through. That's good. But to have an expectation or a kind of a requirement of how we're going to go, probably not a great idea. And I've seen that sometimes, where people have this idealistic notion of how they're going to be when they're dying. And if it's not that way, they can be disappointed or feel like they've failed in some way. And we don't want to set ourselves up for that kind of thing. You know, being open, doing what we can to help the mind be in a good place moment to moment, day to day in our life. This is what's beautiful. Like Ajahn Danaha, you know, sati, samadhi, and panya all the time. You know, the more we cultivate that, the more likely that's going to be the ongoing trajectory. Huang?
Hello.
Hello.
So I have two thoughts. The first thing is I just believe in like the fairness of
Mm.
of I don't know, not of the world, but of karma, maybe, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes total sense. how unfair would it be to live a good life and then in the last moment have some kind of weird mental state come up and dump you in some bad place? It doesn't make sense, does it?
And the other thought I had,
Yeah. Ayya Chitananda was just mentioning the car accident kind of scenario. Could be, we don't know what's going to happen. But I think you're right. There is a fairness, a kind of natural justice with coming.
the other thought I have is when I read the book Satipatthana by Bhikkhu Analayo, he in the chapter about death contemplation, he talked about how death is a process that span some amount of time. It's not like one moment. And he said it take time for the four element to like disintegrate. Like you feel cold and your mouth is dry, and then you get a lot heavier. Like, so I think it's like, it's actually like a process, and you usually will be at your baseline mental condition if you die naturally, you know. Yeah, that's
Very hard to say. Yeah. I mean, I don't have a lot of experience. I was with my mom when she was going through that process for, I stayed with her for about 3 months. And so I was there for the whole process. And it's very hard to say sometimes. I mean, it's, you know, probably not going to go the way we think it will go. And that's okay. To be open and willing for it to be a bit of a surprise. And also, you know, it might take longer than we think it would, or quicker than we think it would, or whatever. But there's the body. It's so clear at that time that the body does not belong to us. It just has its own process, its own timing, its own winding down of the karmic forces and energy it has, and all of that. And yeah, and to really have this acceptance, this idea that it's okay, you know, it's okay now what the body is doing. It's got its problems, parts are wearing out. It's, you know, like, can we just be present with it the way it is, and, you know, do what we can to support it. And in that moment, in that period, in that process, I mean, yeah, this idea of the final moment, this is this commentarial thing. It's not about that. It's the process. If we can be with the body the way it is right now, accepting its limitations, and every human body has limitations. I mean, you know, you can't just walk outside and pick the house up if you've got some problem in the plumbing. You know, you got like, there's limitations to. We may have expectations about what we should be able to do with this body, but that doesn't make it. Would you get that, Deborah? Just, yeah, you can just answer or stop it. Could you just go outside with that, or in another room? Sorry. The point being that we're probably gonna die the way we live. And mentally, you know, who knows what will happen, but if we develop this ability to be present, kind, accepting, you know, creative, curious. One of the things Lynn and I were talking about earlier is being curious about this whole thing. Like, this is going to be an adventure. Ajahn Brahm talks about, you know, like, if you won a trip to an exotic place and you have to wait 2 months before you can go, you're going to think, why not next week? Why can't I go now? This will be an adventure. Kind of like having the phone ring really loud in the middle of the Dhamma. It's okay. Just to know what you're doing mostly is what's going to take the biggest, have the biggest influence. I think it's fair to say. Did you want to say anything else, Wal?
I'm good.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Karuna Buddhist Vihara.
I'm not exactly sure where I'm going with this, but I wanted to explore the idea of our debt to our parents. The Buddha said that you have debt to two people and they're your parents. And the idea of, killing, but not killing in an active way, but, through neglect. That this some people didn't have the best upbringings or childhood or whatever, and how do you like I said, I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but it's a bit of a reflection on my relationship with my parents, but also in respect to, as I cared for my dad, who had a long old age sickness death period. It was like graduate work in old age sickness death. I have some regrets that I didn't really recognize the early signs of macular degeneration, and thought that he may just need new glasses prescription, and had I acted more quickly, he may have not lost the sight in one of his eyes, or so that idea that you it's not just an active killing, but maybe not paying attention to care of our parents as we get older. Yeah.
So it's interesting to me that the Buddha, like I look at the Dhamma Vinaya, which is what the Buddha said, this is going to be your teacher after I'm gone, Dhamma Vinaya. He didn't appoint anyone to take over. Because there's no living being on the earth who can fill the Buddha's shoes, basically. That'll be whenever the next Buddha comes. But the Dhamma Vinaya, there's no reference that I can think of to some kind of fault by omission. So it's not that kind of concept. If, and this may sound strange, but I've had conversations like this with monks, like if someone is drowning in the river and you're sitting on the bank and you don't jump in and save them, you're not at fault for that. And you were taking care of your dad. I know from being a parent and from being a child of parents, even when you're doing what you see as the best you can at that time doesn't necessarily mean that you're covering all the bases. And in fact, you can't cover them all. It's too complicated. It's too complex to get all the decisions correct. And everybody has their own karma. And there's also this reality, in my experience, that there are some things that just seem to be hidden from us. And this comes out in the Vinaya also, where Ananda gets blamed after the Buddha dies for not having pleaded with the Buddha to stay longer. You know, you see that in the suttas as well. This account of the Buddha saying, you know, someone who's developed the psychic potency, you know, could stay for a long time. This is kind of a broad hint to Ananda to ask him to stay. And he gets blamed. Ananda gets blamed for not having done that. And he said, Mara was hiding that from me. You know, like there, and I have experienced times where it's just like you cannot see it. And there's some kind of karmic action force happening there, it feels like to me. And so it's like to blame ourselves for what we didn't know or didn't see, that's a rabbit hole of proliferation that is completely unnecessary, in my opinion. Or maybe we can learn a little bit about how to be in the next situation, but to blame ourselves for that takes it too far. And yes, we can, you know, try to sharpen our awareness and our ability to be present with things and to be careful. This is part of learning mindfulness. Sometimes a part that is really challenging for new monastics, where they're being told kind of, you know, no, you have to do this differently and you have to do that differently. And particularly when people enter monastic life at an older age, that can really feel irritating, but it's part of the training. So we train ourselves, we can train ourselves, but it's really, in some sense, quite unfair, I think, to kind of blame ourselves for the things that fell through the cracks or decisions that with 2020 hindsight we would have thought we could have made differently. You know, all we can do is really try to be as present and aware as possible and take the best decision we can at the time and let it go. And, you know, certainly there are so many situations where people don't get the care that would have been good to get, or, you know, even worse, I have no doubt that there's a lot of elder abuse going on in the world, and that is extremely sad. And whenever we have an opportunity to try to intervene with such a thing, it would be important to do it if we can, I think, and you know, this kind of thing. But yeah, losing your sight in one eye, these things are normal for aging. At another time in human history, not that long ago, wouldn't have been anything you could do about it anyway. You know, we got to think in terms of the big picture sometimes. This is just, you know, we can't save the people in our life from all the suffering. We can do what we can. Did I answer all the questions or no?
Yes.
Thank you. Paula?
So I have two things I wanted to bring up. One, this idea of what you're doing in this lifetime, and what you're doing before death, and how that could affect you in the future. I wanted to bring up something I recently read in the biography of Ajahn Jia Chundo, the gold wrapped in rags, and he brought up the story about Angulimala. And of course, we've all heard about Angulimala, but you know, the serial killer who then became an arahant. And he's like, he says, this is the paragraph that found it: how on earth could a villainous murderer known to have killed nearly 1,000 people in cold blood subsequently attain the exalted status of arahant? The answer is that having examined the accumulation of spiritual wealth on Angulimala's heart, the Buddha saw that during his eons-long journey through samsaric existence, he had been responsible for an incalculable number of virtuous acts of generosity, moral integrity, and spiritual awareness. He had thus amassed an enormous quantity of worthy karma, the cumulative effect of which was immeasurably greater than the consequences of the evil actions he committed in his present life. I found that really fascinating. And it kind of adds another little wrench to what we're talking about. And he goes on to say that you can never really tell what a person is like just by looking at them. But this it's on page 224 if you're interested, and it's available through the website at Abaya Gary for free. But I just feel like there's no real knowing what your past karma, how your current state of what you're doing completely, how it's going to affect your next life. And I don't really think that I spend a lot of time worrying and thinking about what's going to happen to this conventional self when I die, because I think it's a process that that's my understanding of it. And so I don't know if this is my attitude of nothing really matters. And so I'm not really working it out or even going in to think about it. But I just wonder why it matters to think about that, what's going to happen. And my approach is what you were just saying, to be present and aware as possible. Does that, I don't know if I'm like in a state of denial or what.
No, I think what you're talking about is fine. I mean, if we're not worried about it, that's fine. If we just pay attention, I mean, this is really what the Buddha said. Don't worry about the future. Pay attention to what you're doing now. But I think what we're talking about is the natural tendency for many people to worry about the future.
Okay.
And, when the Buddha, one of my favorite suttas, the powers in Anguttara Nikaya 9, number 5, like if you develop those 4 powers of, wisdom, knowing what's wholesome and unwholesome, and energy, the energy to develop the wholesome and reject the unwholesome, and the blamelessness of, living really purely, and the development and maintenance of good relationships, then you don't have to worry about 5 things, including what will happen after you die. And so it's again that idea that you put in the effort now, you put in the effort to do the right thing, and we do the best we can. And yes, I think part of this idea that we don't know what's really in one's history, what's really in anyone else's history, what's really in their heart. So stop making judgments about people and have compassion. Yes, look at the actions they're taking. Clearly, it's a bad idea to kill people. Clearly it's horrible. I can only imagine what Angulimala's mind must have had to deal with flashbacks and God. And according to the commentary, he was doing that because he was told to by his spiritual teacher. So he was under a certain kind of delusion that pushed him in this direction. And, how does that weigh in if that was actually the case? Again, following the wrong God's home, we got to pay attention to what we're being told, and does it accord with the Dhamma or not? And, we can be under massive kind of curtains of delusion sometimes. And we can look back and maybe see massive curtains of delusion that we've torn away. And thank goodness we've torn them away, So, yeah, this whole idea of you know, turning karma upside down and looking at people who have misfortune and kind of blaming them because they must have done something bad in the past. This is completely wrong. That's not the way to hold these things. Have compassion, be kind. None of us knows what's in our own past. None of us knows what's really in that person's past or why that situation is the way it is. Stop trying, stop trying to figure it out, and certainly don't, not that I'm saying you're doing any of this, Paula, but, certainly we should not dismiss someone else and their situation because, they must have done something bad. This is really the wrong way to think. And so I think that there's value in this kind of reflection. And, it's really all to support us to be wholesome, to be loving, to be kind, to be clear and virtuous and generous, and to let go of our fears and worries for the self. So like what you're saying is, yeah, I don't think much about it. I mean, that's part of what the trust in the practice means, and trust in the Dhamma means. If we trust in the triple gem and our kind of efforts to conform to that or to live in that, to rejoice in that, then we don't really have to worry, and we won't.
So what you're saying makes me feel good, because I'm feeling like I must have more trust than I think. Because that's the way I live my life. I just figure this is the way it is. And so I've kind of made that shift, but so thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Paula. James?
Thank you for touching this subject. I've heard this idea of this final mind moment before, and it didn't really make sense to me. But your sort of explanation for why it doesn't make sense is the clearest I've heard. So that's helpful, really. It's reassuring and comforting, yeah, your words, what you said, that it just reinforces that just put those causes and conditions in place, and good things will happen, basically. And words like fairness of justice have come up, but it strikes me that that's kind of human kind of concepts in the human world. There's justice, there's injustice, there's fairness, there's unfairness. But it almost feels to me like karma is more impersonal than that. Like it's not like someone's deciding or judging you, basically. And the problem with that situation is it can be capricious. It can be like not necessarily just. It's just the way things are. So. And strangely, I find it comforting that it is impersonal in that way. It's just, like I say, it's just the way things are, really.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, there was something else I was going to say, but I'm sort of, oh dear. But I like what you said about Ajahn Brahm says. I mean, it'll be interesting to find out. So part of me almost looks forward to death, because it's kind of like, well, at least I'll finally find out the truth. Be like the last great adventure, I suppose. And you articulated it a lot better than me. But what you said just now about just trusting in the Dharma, trusting in the teachings, trusting in that doing the right thing will have the right consequences is and just having faith in that. That's what you need. And I kind of felt like death is just another thing in the future. So practice for the next day or the next hour or the next minute or what, it doesn't really make any difference. You're still going to be doing the same thing, which is putting the teachings into practice.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it is good to remember that death can come at any time, and to be ready, to have our ducks in a row, and
I've started up me and a Dhamma friend have started up a little chat group, so we can have a little Zoom session of our own between the three of us chatting about these things. And John's over 70, and he was saying last night when we had our first session about how I'm closest to death, and I had to stop and remind him that no, you don't know.
Yeah,
Anyone in this room could be, just because I've got 30 years less than him doesn't mean I'm next minute might be the end. So yeah,
that's right. That's right. None of us knows, and as someone pointed out, it is the case as we get older that we know it's closer, and every breath is a breath closer to death, and every day is a day closer to death. And to have that in mind in a way that's inspiring, that's encouraging, to use our time well, and to really pack this life with goodness, that's really what we can do that's best for ourselves and best for everyone around us.
It's funny you mentioned people going blind in one eye as they get older, because I was in the shop where I work today, and we had an old lady come in, and she was quite clearly blind in one eye, and it gave me the opportunity to sort of really help her out, guide her through the shop, try and find something that would please her. Didn't really work out because she couldn't remember what song she was after, and she couldn't really browse. But you were saying about that Sri Lankan practice of noting down the good deeds you do, and I think I just felt like really taking time out of the day to make sure that she was guided around and taken care of was a real positive thing to give to the world, and that's one of the most important parts of practice for me, is those lots of little ways in which you can sort of give and do good things. And it's not all about mindfulness and meditation and that kind of stuff. It's what you're doing every minute of every day that sets you up for the better future.
And her interaction with you and the care you took might have been the best thing she could have found in the store.
Yeah, honestly, I hope so. That's it. I always remember that, obviously, the idea is we're there to make money, but I think of it in a lot broader range than that. And I've got a great boss because he's sort of similar kind of wavelength. He'll spend an hour finding like a 7-inch single for someone that's only going to make him £1, so it's basically a net loss, but someone walks away happy, and we've made so many friends and supporters just through that.
Yep. My dad used to say, if you work an hour, you'll get paid for an hour eventually. It was his understanding of karma too. It's like, make someone happy, they walk away happy. You don't even know what the return is on that. You never will. And it doesn't matter. It's like, this is what we want to do. And even, we were talking a little bit earlier about that informal practice. And, it's like, even if, you're working at a high pressure company and you're in a meeting, and somehow your presence or your attitude or something you might say brings the temperature down, this is all good. This is what we can do moment by moment in our life. So thank you all for sharing. Thank you, James, and everyone. And I will say that I'm going to not be leading this program for the next 3 weeks. For the next 2 weeks, Adrienne will be hosting, and I appreciate that a lot. I'm going to be doing some solo practice here for the end of the Vasa. And then as soon as we end the Vasa on the 17th, we're going to be flying to the East Coast to help with an ordination, so there won't be a program that Saturday. I think it's the 19th. So just hope to see you again the following week in October. What is that, the 26th or something? And then, and the 25th for our first Friday night Sutta study. So we will be going to Friday nights and Saturday mornings at the Sunnyvale Center. And I look forward to seeing you all then. And I hope you have a really good last couple weeks of Vasa. If you're doing any particular practice during this time or not, just have a great few weeks, and I'll see you later. Take care, everyone. Thank you.